You may remember the story of Lazarus, who had died and who was in a tomb, and who Jesus came to visit at the invitation of his sisters, Martha and Mary, after Lazarus had already died. Can you leave those just down? Thank you. And so he comes there, and Martha and Mary are grieving, and Martha greets him and says to him, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." And Jesus engages in a dialogue with her, and he comes to ask her a question that we ordinarily associate with a question of the head. But in the midst of grief over the death of her brother, it is a question that hits her very deep in the gut. And he says to her, "Do you believe? Do you believe?" And her response is, "Yes, I believe that you are the resurrection and the life, and at the last day you will stand again." And this confrontation, this direct addressing of what it means to be a person of faith, of what it means to have belief in those circumstances, is poignant. We have in the scriptures this morning two stories, one of the life of Abraham and Sarah that is resolved as a question of faith, a question of belief, and then a gospel account that is unresolved, in which Jesus is introducing new circumstances that will test a great many people's belief. And the thing that distinguishes this approach to belief as one that goes from head to heart and deep within our spirits is not whether there is information or whether there are facts to be agreed with or not agreed with, but this kind of belief that Jesus is asking about is a belief that has to do with trust. Will you be there for me? And if any of you have had a person in your life or have one right now who you trust implicitly, who you can rely on through any circumstance, no matter what may come, you believe in that person that they will be present for you. And the power of presence cannot be overestimated. To have that source of security, to have that assurance, not that that person that you believe is there for you will control outcomes, not that they can change circumstances, but rather that they will journey with you, is a great source of faith. And this is the kind of faith that we are thinking about in the season of Lent. The faith that goes down into deep places, not that influences the outcomes in our lives to all be celebratory, all be those that we are hoping for, but instead it is a faith that is rooted in trust in a relationship. We know from both stories of the Gospels and from circumstances in our own lives that the promise of faith is not a promise that things will always go our way, but is instead a promise that God's presence, just like that person that you know will always be there for you, is abiding. And that's what Jesus was asking Martha and in the 11th chapter of the Gospel of John. He was asking her, do you believe that God's presence is with you even in this moment, in the depth of your grief? Abraham is confronted with a question that also comes in circumstances that seem very difficult, if not impossible, to understand. God comes to Abram before his name is changed and says, do you believe that I am able to give you descendants? It's not the language that the Scriptures uses, but that is the question that Abraham is confronted with. And God makes this vow that from you will come a multitude of descendants, and on behalf of Sarah as well, you will be the forebearer of nations. This is an awesome and incomprehensible promise that they are given. But as we heard in Paul's writing to the Romans, the acceptance of that promise became a source of great strength for Abraham and Sarah throughout the rest of their lives. It had been preceded in their lives by a trust that God was leading them, but it was confirmed again that that relationship was abiding for them, and it undergirded their belief. It's the confidence that God will be present that undergirds our belief as well. How is it that we have seen and heard and known God's abiding presence with us? And if God comes to us and asks us a similar question, do you believe? What will we be able to draw upon in our answer of faith? Sometimes there is a substitution that gets made that is a misplacement of faith that has to do with outcomes, getting what we want and equating that with God's blessing. And so when we have things that are sources of security in our lives, material or employment-based or health-based or relationship-based, then we say God has blessed us, and these are evidences of that. But there's a story in the Gospel of Mark earlier on, or actually the chapter right after the one that we have just heard, in which a man comes to Jesus whose son has been what the Gospel describes as possessed by a demon since his early childhood, and the man is frantic. And he describes these symptoms about this child being possessed and being thrown into fire and being thrown into water and being threatened to be destroyed because of the violent convulsions that he has experienced. And Jesus enters into a dialogue with him as well, similar to the one he entered into with Mary. And at last the man cries out. Jesus hasn't done anything, but the man cries out, "I believe, help my unbelief." I believe, help my unbelief. Have you experienced that before? This seeming contradiction. I yearn, God, I know that you're with me, but I'm having a hard time. I'm struggling with being able to know that you're really with me. Help my unbelief. And it is after that that this man cries out in such wonderful honesty, such relatable candor. After that Jesus goes and heals his son and casts out this demon. But it is following the admission that sometimes I am in a place of unbelief, God, and I need you to draw me forward towards you to help my unbelief. That is an expression of desiring the relationship first and foremost, of wanting to be close with God. So in this gospel passage that we hear read this morning, in which Jesus is telling them that a central part, a necessary part of the journey of faith with Him is going to be confrontation with His death, I imagine Peter's response being similar to the Father's that will come a chapter later. Help my unbelief. No, this must not happen to you. And Jesus confronts him and says, you are dwelling on human things when you need to be dwelling on heavenly things. Not on the outcome that you're afraid of, but on the assurance that I am giving you that I will be with you for all time. So that is similarly our invitation in this season of Lent. After confronting Peter, Jesus goes on to talk about where we place our trust, where the attachments of our lives are rooted. Are they rooted in things that are temporal or transitory, things that are in our lives for a period and then will disappear? Or are they rooted in that abiding presence that was promised and fulfilled to Abraham and Sarah, that was promised and fulfilled to Jesus' disciples? Those are the things in which faith is rewarded. So if the question is coming to us, do you believe? Then these scriptures this morning and the others that I am relaying as well in relationship are inviting us to go to that place of not temporal existence, not of intellectual assent, but of deep, deep gut and spirit assurance and trust in God's abiding presence in our lives. May that be the presence that we continually seek and that we draw upon in all of the circumstances that we go through, so that our experience of being blessed by God's faithfulness may resemble those who have gone before us, even when we are saying we believe, help our unbelief, and allowing God to meet us in those places just as in the places of our certainty. Amen.